Hello everyone, RJM3 here. Welcome back to What If, the alternate history series where I speculate what could have been if history had gone differently. Today, we begin another two-parter where we'll be exploring what would have happened if the War of 1812 wasn't a stalemate and one side actually managed to win. In this first part, I'll be discussing what could have been if the United States won the War of 1812.
So first things first, what exactly was the War of 1812? Well, our story begins, unsurprisingly, in the year 1812. For years, the United Kingdom of Great Britain has been at war with Napoleon's France. To combat this great new threat to king and country, the British greatly expand the Royal Navy to a total of 600 ships. But to run such a massive navy, you need sailors. And you see, a lot of British sailors didn't really feel like dying in a war, so they fled in droves to the United States to avoid service, going as far as to become American citizens. So to make up for this, the Royal Navy began to implement the rather shady tactic of impressment. Basically, British ships would stop American ships to search for British deserters and force them back into service, kicking and screaming. They would do this even if the deserters had already obtained American citizenship. The United States was quite outraged by this, and from America's perspective, the British were boarding neutral American ships and kidnapping American citizens. Tensions only continued to escalate as the British began arming a confederacy of Native American tribes in the Great Lakes territories under the leadership of the warrior and chief of the Shawnee tribe, Tecumseh, and the U.S. did not like that. Not one bit. With the impressment of Americans by the British and British support of Tecumseh's Confederacy, you might think that the British were the aggressors and the instigators of the conflict. And you'd be completely right. On June 18, 1812, Congress issued its first ever declaration of war on the United Kingdom, overseen by American President James Madison. For the second time in history, America and Britain were at war. So how exactly did America plan on waging war on the British Empire? The answer? Canada. Though the former 13 colonies had long since broken free of British control, Britain's Canadian territories further north were more than content with remaining loyalist bootlickers. But now, the United States would invade Canada, seizing it from the British, and annexing it, acquiring more of that sweet, succulent manifest destiny. However, things didn't quite go to plan. While the U.S. certainly held the numbers advantage, they were greatly hindered by inexperience and general incompetence. While successfully burning down the city of York, modern-day Toronto, the Americans were repelled from Canada by British and Canadian forces. After the first defeat of Napoleon in 1814, the UK was able to commit more troops to the American front. The British proceeded to land forces in Maryland, capture in Washington, D.C., and burn down the White House. However, things began to go south for the British as well. Tecumseh was killed in battle. The same British troops that burned D.C. were defeated in Baltimore. Another British force attempting to invade New York State was crushed in Plattsburgh, and the troops on their way to invade New Orleans were taken too long. With the war left in a total deadlock, diplomats from the US and UK met at Ghent in the Netherlands and agreed to a status quo peace, as in no border changes whatsoever. With the Treaty of Ghent signed on Christmas Eve 1814, the War of 1812 was over. Well, not really. Being the 1800s, it took a while for word of the treaty to get around. The British force heading for New Orleans didn't arrive until after the treaty was signed, only to lose embarrassingly. The War of 1812 officially and completely ended on February 17, 1815. America didn't win or lose, Britain didn't win or lose. The only group who definitively lost were the natives. Most people nowadays actually don't know about the War of 1812. It's not taught in American schools, it's not taught in British schools. The only nation that remembers the War of 1812 is Canada. Canadians remember the war very patriotically, how they were able to defend their homeland from an American invasion, and as a result, Canada continues to exist to the present day, now known all around the world for their ice hockey, maple syrup, and good old Justin Trudeau. Okay, now let's rewind a bit and answer the main question of this video. What if America had won the War of 1812? How could this have been achieved? Well, in order for America to win the war, there's going to need to be a few divergence points. But the main idea here is that the US needs to swiftly and successfully invade and conquer Canada before Napoleon is defeated in 1814. Simple as that. As our first point of divergence, British Major General Isaac Brock, arguably the man most responsible for preparing Upper Canada, modern-day Ontario, for a war with the United States and most of the UK's victories in the early part of the war, dies years before the war even breaks out. As a result, the British never captured Detroit and the United States wins the Battle of Queenston Heights. Our second point of divergence is in April 1813. Rather than burning down York, American generals stick with the original plan of attacking Kingston instead, the more strategically vital target. Our third and final point of divergence is in the following month of May. After capturing Fort George, American command decides to immediately pursue the retreating British forces instead of hesitating, preventing the British counterattack at the Battle of Stony Creek in June, leaving Upper Canada practically defenseless. York would fall within the following months, and so would all of Upper Canada. With the situation out west completely under their control, the American military would turn its full attention to Lower Canada, aka modern-day Quebec. Because of this, Canadian militia failed to stop the American armies heading for Montreal in October of 1813. Quebec City would soon follow in its footsteps. By the start of 1814, the majority of what were the Canadian territories is now under American occupation. With the war against Napoleon having just ended, the UK is weary of war and sees Canada as a lost cause. The British sue for peace and the war comes to an end, and the United States of America is able to annex the entirety of British Canada. For the second time in 20 years, the US would double its size, and within the span of 50 years, the British Empire would go from dominating North America to having been kicked out of the mainland completely. So after the war ends, how would the US govern the former Canadian territories? Particularly, how would the US handle Quebec? Quebec has had a predominantly French-speaking and Catholic population since before the 7 Years' War when it was controlled by France. In our timeline, the Canadians have mostly tolerated Quebec's French roots, even if it has created a conflict of interest. The US, on the other hand, is having none of it. Just like Louisiana, English would be declared the official language of the American state of Quebec, and French would slowly but surely be phased out. Another important thing to consider is the shape of the Canadian states themselves. By looking at a map of our timeline, you can tell that the average Canadian province is far larger than the average American state. This is because Canada has always had a less dense population than America, making larger provinces a necessity. But with Canada being a part of America, the government would encourage migration not just westward, but northward too, increasing the local population density, allowing Ontario and Quebec to be broken into smaller pieces. Though northern Canada would still be lightly populated territories, probably due to the fact that it's a frozen hellhole. Not only would this change the borders of the states in Canada, but also in the American West. With Britain out of the way, the Treaty of 1818 is never signed, meaning America is able to claim all the land in the Canadian West that Britain claimed in our timeline, and never has to briefly share the Oregon Territory. The US-Canadian border along the 49th parallel never exists, meaning any wacky alternate states could overlap what would have been that line. However, there's another, less pleasant reason why the American West would be reshaped. The reason being slavery. You see, for the first half of the 19th century, the U.S. government had to maintain a delicate balance between the free states and the slave states. But with the acquisition of Canada, America just received a large influx of land to become potential free states, greatly throwing off the balance of power between North and South. So America would need to greatly compensate for this imbalance. Not only would the Missouri Compromise line be moved further north, but the U.S. would need to acquire more land for the South. This brings us to Mexico and the Texas Revolution. After Texas won their independence from Mexico in 1836 of our timeline, there were some Texans who wanted to join the U.S., but the U.S. government was hesitant to annex Texas due to the free and slave state balance, and Texas wasn't annexed until 1845. But with the balance already leaning towards the free states, this alternate United States pushes for the annexation of Texas immediately, breaking up Texas into two or more pieces to make more slave states. Of course, by annexing Texas this soon, the Mexican-American War would be triggered a decade earlier than in our timeline. Of course, just like our timeline, Mexico would lose embarrassingly, but unlike our timeline, to finally restore balance between the free and slave states, rather than be content with only taking Mexico's heavily unpopulated northern territories, the U.S. would take an even larger piece out of Mexico, going past the Rio Grande and annexing many northern Mexican states into the Union, creating room for more slave states. Though I doubt the U.S. would push to annex all of Mexico, as Mexico is far less culturally homogeneous with the United States than Canada is. So how would the U.S. treat the northern Mexican states? Well, remember what I said about Quebec earlier? Well, second verse, same as the first. English is declared the official language of these states and is flooded with American settlers. So yeah, with the alternate Missouri Compromise and the larger Mexican cession, American slavery is far more widespread in this alternate timeline. Imagine Kansas being a slave state. Imagine Sonora being a slave state. Imagine California being a slave state. Now that is some scary stuff. All of this done in the name of avoiding civil war. But the funny thing about the American Civil War was that the moment Eli Whitney patented the cotton gin, it was inevitable. In 1860, the South would still declare its independence in response to the ascension of the abolitionist Republican Party, forming the Confederate States of America. Just like its northern counterpart, the Confederacy is far larger in this alternate timeline. Because of this, the American Civil War is fought on a larger, more destructive scale, from Atlantic to Pacific. Similar to the East, there would be border states out west still loyal to the Union, and they would also still have the extra resources and manpower from Canada at their disposal, so the North isn't terribly disadvantaged and they would still win. Just as in our timeline, the slaves would be freed and America would rebuild. Shortly after the war, the U.S. would still acquire Alaska and annex Hawaii later on. In 1898, the Spanish-American War still breaks out over the Cuban Independence War and the Maine Incident. The U.S. still annexes Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, but unlike our timeline, instead of Cuba finally becoming independent, the U.S. would annex Cuba itself due to increasingly imperialistic tendencies, creating something of an American empire.
Now, is this not the most beautiful thing you have ever seen?
Entering into the 20th century, this new American empire would see the ignition of the Great War just across the Atlantic. Whether or not it chooses to remain neutral or pick one side or the other ultimately depends on whether or not Anglo-American relations have healed by then. If so, America would choose to remain neutral at least until German unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram would force their hand and join the Entente. They would mostly focus on invading what remained of Mexico and just partially on breaking what remained of the German forces on the Western Front, with the war ending exactly as it did in our timeline, except Mexico is just gone. Though, if relations between the US and UK haven't recovered, then the United States would side with the Central Powers. In 1915 or 16, America enters the war, seizing the Bahamas, Jamaica, and Belize from Britain. The U.S. would clash with the Royal Navy in the Atlantic to break the British blockade, and clash with the Empire of Japan in the Pacific to defend American and German possessions, and possibly even open up another front in Siberia. All of these actions combined would tilt the Great War in Germany's favor, allowing the Central Powers to come out on top.
And that's what would have happened if the United States won the War of 1812. My closing thoughts? This timeline is definitely interesting, and America is definitely better off by the end of it. And you know what? If the US government suddenly decided tomorrow that they wanted to annex Canada, I'd fully support that. Anyway, be sure to join us next time in the What If Season 1 finale, where we'll explore what would have happened if Britain won the war instead. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. This has been RJM3, Alternate Historian. Have a nice day.